Amos Thatcher had lived with loneliness for so long that it had become his only companion. For 30 years he hadn't spoken more than a sentence to another soul, hadn't received a letter, hadn't stepped off his property unless it was to bury a dead dog or drag a dying cow to the far hill. That morning, like every other, he sat quietly in his rickety old wooden chair on the porch, a cold cup of coffee in hand, his empty eyes watching the sun inch its way over the eastern mountains. The wind carried the sharp bite of early winter, brushing against his skin like a reminder. Another day had come and gone, and he was still here, a breathing corpse, stripped of purpose. He had grown used to the silence, the way the wind howled through the cracked window panes, the way feral cats scratched the wooden walls at night, and the unsettling quiet that settled after the sun disappeared. No one visited, no one asked, and he preferred it that way. Amos had become a part of the land, dry, cold, and silent, like the soil beneath his boots. He had lost his wife, lost his daughter, lost every reason to keep going. Grief hadn't killed him, but it had hollowed him out, eaten away at him slowly, until all that remained was a weathered shell, breathing out of habit. He had once tried writing a letter. Years ago, during a rare wave of longing, he'd scribbled a note to his sister back east, but the letter was never sent. What would be the point? She was probably dead by now, and if she wasn't, would she even recognize the broken, bitter man Amos had become? Better to let the world think he died long ago. He had even carved his own wooden grave marker. Here lies a man who gave up. It sat in the corner of the barn, beside the shovel he planned to use when the time came to dig his own hole. Amos no longer dreamed, no longer cried. He no longer believed in anything, except death. And he didn't fear it. In truth, he welcomed it. It felt like release after 3 decades of slow suffocation. He had nothing left to give, and no one left to hold. For him, life had become a never-ending morning, a sun that never warmed, and a heart that had long since stopped wanting to beat. The girl didn't cry. That was the first thing Amos noticed. She didn't scream, didn't beg, didn't even tremble, not at first. She just stood there in the middle of his barn, her bare feet dust-caked, her small hands clenched around a crumpled note, and her wide, dark eyes staring back at him like a cornered animal. And yet, those eyes weren't filled with fear, not exactly. They were filled with something colder, something deeper, a kind of mute, exhausted fury, like she had been screaming for weeks in silence, and now she was done screaming. Now she was just surviving. When Amos read the note, his fingers tightened involuntarily. "Please help Clementine. Bad men took her mama. She can't hear or speak. Trust no one in town. They're coming." There was a desperation in that handwriting, the kind that could only be carved by someone writing with shaking hands, knowing they were about to die. And Clementine, she didn't have to explain anything. The bruises on her arms, the dried blood behind her ear, the way she kept glancing at the barn door, like it might burst open at any second, it told him everything. And that's when Amos felt it, a rage he hadn't known in decades. He thought he'd buried anger alongside grief, the day he put his wife and child in the ground, thought it had rotted away inside him like everything else. But looking at this little girl, at the raw terror behind her stillness, that rage came roaring back, red hot and blinding. Someone had hurt this child, someone had taken her mother, someone had decided she didn't matter. And worse than all of that, those men wore badges. Amos knew the face of evil in a man. Not the kind that came with wild eyes and shaking hands. No, the worst kind was the quiet one, the polite one, the kind that smiled as it pulled a trigger and called it justice. And Langston, Deputy Marshal Wade Langston, was exactly that kind of evil. The sound of hooves on dry earth snapped Amos out of his thoughts. Clementine heard it too. Her fingers gripped his wrist, tighter than he expected from someone so small. And through the slats of the barn he saw them, 3 riders, dust trailing behind, their silhouettes familiar in a way that made his stomach twist. The lead rider's badge glinted in the sunlight, and Amos felt bile rise in his throat. Langston, the same man who had smiled while evicting families, the same one who had asked one too many questions about that house fire on Sycamore Ridge, the one who'd offered Amos a drink at the town's saloon years ago, saying things like, "Some folks just don't belong in these parts." At the time, Amos didn't care enough to challenge him. Now he wanted to drive a pitchfork through the bastard's throat. They entered his barn without knocking, without shame, like they owned the ground they stood on. "We're looking for a little girl," Langston said with that smirk, the kind of smirk only a man with power and no conscience can wear. Might be wandering around, confused. Confused? Is that what he called it? A girl running from the murderers of her family was confused? Amos wanted to spit in his face, wanted to throw the shovel at his head, but he played the part, the grumpy old hermit, the dying man with nothing to hide. But inside, he was boiling, because he knew what these men were, knew exactly what they'd done. Clementine didn't need to speak. Her silence screamed volumes. They'd watched her family burn, probably laughed about it, and now they were here to finish the job. Not for justice, not even for money, but to erase witnesses, because a deaf little girl had seen too much, and they were doing it all under the authority of law. That was the part that twisted the knife. Amos had lived long enough to see evil wear many faces, but nothing disgusted him more than a badge on the chest of a killer. Nothing enraged him more than the way Langston spoke like he was doing the girl a favor, like he was reuniting her with family. Her family was dead, and if Amos hadn't opened that barn door when he did, she would be too. He could feel Clementine trembling now, not because she was afraid of Langston, but because she recognized him, because her body remembered what her ears could never hear, the gunshots, the screams, the crackling flames, and Amos knew in that moment he would die before letting these men touch her. This wasn't about kindness. This wasn't about redemption. This was about righteous fury. These men thought Amos Thatcher was just an old fool waiting to die, but they were wrong. They'd awakened something, and Amos was done being silent. The barn smelled like old hay and dust, the air still and heavy, as if it too was holding its breath. Amos stood just inside the doorway, his hand resting on the worn wood of the pitchfork, eyes narrowed as Langston and his two deputies swaggered in like they owned the place. They didn't knock. They didn't ask. They moved with the confidence of men who'd gotten away with too much for too long. Deputy Marshal Wade Langston smiled, but Amos saw no kindness in it, only calculation. "Heard you might have seen something unusual this morning, Thatcher." Amos didn't flinch. He'd played this game before. "Only unusual thing I seen is lawmen trespassing on a dying man's property." Langston chuckled like it was all the joke, but it wasn't, not to Amos. This barn was the last safe place for that little girl, hiding under the old horse blanket in the corner, holding her breath. Her name was Clementine, and she'd already lost everything, and now these bastards were here to finish what they'd started. The thin deputy with the rat-like face gave Amos a cold grin. "Yeah, we heard about your condition, old man. Shame you're gonna die out here alone." Then he leaned closer, voice low and venomous. "But that gives us an idea." Amos felt his blood turn to fire. "What if," the deputy continued, "we told folks you died yesterday, real peaceful-like, natural causes. Then we'd have no trouble searching this place proper." The audacity, the gall of it. Amos had seen evil before, but never so arrogant. These men wore badges not to uphold justice, but to cloak their crimes. And now they were standing in his barn, threatening him, threatening a child, like it was nothing. Amos's fingers curled tighter around the pitchfork. He fought the urge to swing it into Langston's smug face right then and there. Langston stepped closer, reeking of whiskey and power. "We're looking for a girl, about 11, dark hair, probably scared, confused." Scared, yes, but not confused. Clementine knew exactly what she was running from. Amos had seen the terror in her eyes, the instinct to hide, to vanish. It wasn't confusion, it was survival. Langston's tone turned cold. "Her family had an accident. We're just trying to reunite her with what's left." The word accident rang in Amos's ears like a gunshot. He knew what Langston meant. He knew the kind of accidents that left a child covered in ash and bruises, running barefoot across ranch land in silence. "I ain't seen no children," Amos said flatly, voice like gravel. "Don't get visitors. Too busy dying." Langston smiled again. "If you're lying to us," he said, stepping close enough to smell, "your last days are going to get a whole lot more painful." It wasn't fear Amos felt. It was fury, a deep, gnawing, white-hot anger. not just at them but at himself, for letting this kind of evil fester so long without ever standing up to it. The moment Langston raised that harness strap and struck him across the shoulder, something in Amos snapped. The pain wasn't the worst part. It was the insult, the mockery. A man who had buried a family, built a life out of brokenness, now being beaten like livestock in his own damn barn by men who killed without remorse. He looked Langston dead in the eye. "Go ahead, beat an old man. That's about what I'd expect from a coward who hides behind a badge and hunts children." That did it. Langston's face turned red, his temper flaring. But before he could strike again, his man called out, "Boss, found something." Amos's heart nearly stopped, but it wasn't Clementine. It was an old photograph, his wife, his daughter. Langston ripped it in half like it was nothing, and that's when the anger boiled over into something else, resolve. These men thought they were invincible. That fear would keep mouths shut and hands still, but they had made a mistake. They had come into his barn, they had threatened his child, and Amos Thatcher was done playing the dying man. The moment the leather strap cracked across his shoulder, Amos Thatcher's world turned red. Not from the pain, he'd lived through worse than pain. The ache in his joints, the hollow in his chest from burying a wife and child, the 30 years of silence and slow death, that was pain. This was different. This was insult. This was the fire of everything he had swallowed burning its way to the surface. Langston smirked, pleased with himself, as if striking an old man proved something. The other deputies stood with smug confidence, boots spreading dust across the floorboards of Amos's barn. His barn, the only thing he had left in this world. But the true match to Amos's fury wasn't the whip or the threats. It was Clementine, that small, silent child, hiding behind the grain bins, covered in dust and fear, gripping the last piece of her broken world between her fingers. She had seen it all, the fire, the murder, the laughter of these bastards as they erased her family from the earth like it meant nothing. And now, cornered like prey, she was getting ready to run again. He could see it in the way her legs tensed, in the frantic shimmer in her eyes. She had no voice to scream, no one left to call mother, no law willing to protect her. They'd taken everything from her, and now they wanted to finish the job under the hollow shield of a star-shaped badge. The barn was filled with the scent of hay, sweat, and something fouler, the stench of corruption. Amos could practically taste the rot in the air. Langston wasn't just a man gone bad. He was a system gone bad, a disease disguised in uniform, a butcher parading as a guardian. And for the first time in 3 decades, Amos felt alive again, not from hope, not from peace, but from wrath. When he saw Clementine shift under the blanket, preparing to bolt, he knew she wouldn't make it. The thin deputy had already begun turning, sensing something. She was going to run, and they were going to gun her down like a rabbit. Not today. Amos knocked over a rusted bucket of grain, letting it crash and roll, loud and sharp. 3 heads turned, hands flew to holsters, eyes fixed on the clumsy old fool. Let them look. Clementine moved like smoke, disappearing behind the bins. Fast, smart, but it bought only seconds. Langston picked up a broken harness and swung it again, grinning like he was swatting a fly. "Maybe that'll help you remember, old man." The strap bit into Amos's ribs, but he didn't flinch. He stared the deputy down with a fire that had taken 30 years to reignite. "You think beating a dying man makes you strong?" Amos spat. "You're nothing but cowards, 3 of you, hunting a child, wearing badges like wolves wear sheep's wool." Langston raised his arm for another strike, but just then a voice called out, "Boss, found something." Amos's heart locked up. But it wasn't Clementine. It was a photo, faded, torn at the edges. Amos with his wife and daughter, before the fever, before the loneliness swallowed him. Langston snatched it, glanced at it like it meant nothing, and tore it in half. "Guess you weren't always alone. Couldn't protect them either, huh?" That did it. The fury in Amos snapped from a smolder into a wildfire. They weren't just threatening Clementine now. They were spitting on his memories, mocking his failures, grinding the last ashes of his soul into the dirt. He watched as Clementine repositioned by the back door, her tiny hands flashing a pattern, tapping her palm. It took Amos a moment, but then he realized she was signaling, communicating, planning. And for the first time, he saw not just fear in her, but resistance. She wasn't running blind. She was leading them into a trap. Langston noticed too. "What are you looking at, old man?" Amos gritted his teeth. just remembering how this place used to look, when men still had honor. Langston turned, squinting toward the shadows. "Boys," he muttered, "I think our friend's playing games." When he started toward Clementine's hiding place, Amos knew the time for words was done. He grabbed the pitchfork and swung it like a man with nothing left to lose. The wooden shaft cracked across Langston's skull with a sickening sound. The badge-wearing snake stumbled forward, his gun slipping from his grip. The other two deputies shouted, weapons drawn, but Amos didn't care. The fury in his chest burned brighter than fear. It didn't matter what they did to him now. He had made his stand. He had protected something pure. And if he was going to die today, it would be on his feet, with fire in his blood, not rot. Gunfire split the air like thunder. Amos didn't duck, he didn't run. He moved. The barn erupted in chaos. Screams, hooves, bullets splintering wood. But none of it mattered. Not the pain in his joints, not the shouting, not even the fear. All that existed now was purpose. Clementine had made it out the back. He'd seen her slip through the shadows like a ghost, swift and silent. One of Langston's men had fired, but missed, barely. Amos had tackled him before the bastard could take another shot. They crashed to the ground, fists flying. But Amos didn't stop until he felt the man go still beneath him. He was too old for this. Every bone screamed, every breath was a thunderclap in his chest. But Amos didn't care. He was done waiting to die. Langston was up again, bleeding from the head, face twisted in rage. The fake lawman wasn't running. Not yet. He wanted revenge. And now he was shouting orders over the gunfire, trying to rally what little control he still had. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life, Thatcher," he howled. But Amos was already moving, crawling toward his pitchfork again, vision blurred by sweat and grit. Through the haze, he saw Clementine crouched behind a log, out of reach but watching. Not scared, focused, determined, a warrior in a child's body. The way she held that signal mirror, the way she'd drawn these monsters into the trap. It wasn't luck, it was courage, it was leadership. And Amos? He was her sword. Langston fired again, the bullet grazing the beam above Amos's head. Wood shattered, dust filled the air. The old man grabbed the pitchfork and lunged behind a feed barrel. The battle raged on outside, rangers on horseback, shouting commands, returning fire with precision. Whitmore's voice cut through the noise like a knife. "Deputy Marshal Langston," he bellowed, "you are under arrest." Langston snarled, "You got no jurisdiction here. The real U.S. Marshals have been hunting your ass for months," Whitmore shouted back. "You're done." But Langston wasn't finished. Desperation made him feral. He grabbed Amos by the collar, pressing a gun to his head. His breath was foul, his hand trembling. "Let us walk, or this old man dies." And Amos, instead of panicking, stared him down. "You think this is how you win?" he said through clenched teeth, "using a dying man as a shield? You lost the second she stepped into my barn." Langston pressed harder, veins bulging in his neck. "Shut up! You afraid of a little girl?" Amos growled. "Then you're already dead." That was when Amos struck. He slammed his elbow into Langston's ribs with everything he had left. The corrupt lawman reeled back, gasping. Amos twisted away, dropping low, just as a shot rang out from one of the rangers. The bullet missed Amos, but found its mark. One of Langston's deputies dropped like a sack of grain. The third man ran for the side door, but he didn't make it. Whitmore himself fired once. Clean, calm, practiced. The man collapsed without a sound. Only Langston remained. And Amos was done running. He charged, pitchfork raised, and tackled Langston with a force that surprised even himself. They went down hard, fists flailing, boots kicking. Langston clawed for his weapon, but Amos got there first. With trembling hands, the old rancher wrestled it away and threw it across the barn. They rolled in the dirt, years of hatred and guilt pouring out through each blow. Amos was gasping now, heart hammering irregularly, vision swimming. But he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. Not while Clementine was still out there, watching. Not while evil still breathed. Langston got on top, hands closing around Amos's throat. "Should have stayed dead," he hissed. And maybe Amos would have, if it weren't for her. He saw her again, Clementine, standing in the doorway now, tears on her cheeks but her back straight, eyes fierce. She wasn't running. She was watching him fight for her. That was enough. With a roar that came from somewhere deep in his soul, Amos reached for the pitchfork, found it by instinct, and rammed it upward into Langston's chest. The man choked, eyes going wide. You killed me." "Yeah," Amos rasped, blood in his throat. "I did." Langston fell, lifeless. The barn went quiet except for the wind. Rangers began shouting confirmation. Secure, clear, suspect down. But Amos didn't hear them. He was on his back, staring up at the rafters, lungs struggling to keep going. Then he felt her hand, Clementine. She knelt beside him, tears falling freely now, and took his hand in hers. It was warm, steady, and full of meaning. He had protected her, and that made this day, this final, furious, glorious day, the greatest of his life. It was quiet now. The gunfire had faded. The dust had begun to settle. The barn, once filled with the chaos of violence and fear, stood still beneath the midday sun. And Amos Thatcher, old, broken, bleeding, lay on his back in the dirt, breathing slow, ragged breaths as the light filtered through the rafters above him. He had expected to die alone. For 30 years, he had waited for death, like it was a train running late, not out of fear, but out of fatigue. He had buried his wife and daughter on the hill behind the house, and had never truly come down from that hill since. His body might have moved, might have chopped wood, fixed fences, sipped bitter coffee, but his soul had stayed there, next to the 2 headstones, frozen in time, waiting, fading, dying in pieces. But not today. Today, Amos had stood up. Today, he had fought, not for himself, not for revenge, but for a child who had no one else. He could still feel Clementine's hand in his, small, trembling, warm. She sat beside him now, her other hand pressed gently against his cheek, eyes filled with something too deep for words. Gratitude, grief, love, and something more, something Amos hadn't seen in so long he'd forgotten what it looked like. Hope. Captain Whitmore knelt nearby, speaking softly, his voice steady. "You did good, Amos. The girl's safe. We've got her. We'll take care of her. You can rest now." Rest. Amos let the word roll through his mind like a blessing. For the first time in decades, he understood what it meant. This wasn't defeat. This wasn't some sad, lonely ending to a meaningless life. This was freedom. Clementine leaned closer, tears slipping silently down her face. Her fingers moved again in delicate patterns, trying to speak in the only language she had. Amos couldn't understand the signs, but he didn't need to. Her eyes told him everything. Thank you. And it was he who should have thanked her. Because in that child's arrival, in the way she clutched his hand, in the way she trusted him without a word, he had remembered something he'd thought long dead. The courage to care. The will to act. The clarity that comes only when you finally decide that some things are worth dying for. For the first time since his wife Sarah and daughter Emma were laid beneath that old oak tree, Amos felt the weight lift. It didn't matter anymore that he had wasted years in grief. It didn't matter that he had pushed everyone away, let the world forget him. What mattered was this one day, this one choice. He had protected her. He had mattered. Clementine reached into her pocket and pressed something into his palm. It was the crumpled note she'd carried that morning, the plea for help that had changed everything. But now, he noticed something on the back, written in a child's careful scrawl. Mama said angels don't always have wings. Some look like regular people. I think you're one. A tear rolled down Amos's cheek, not from pain but from release, from the quiet, overwhelming joy of being seen, of being forgiven by the universe for a silence he had worn like armor for too long. Captain Whitmore touched his shoulder gently. Do you have any family, Amos? Anywhere you want to be buried? Amos turned his head slightly toward the window. Through the slats of the barn, he could just make out the hill behind the house, where the oak tree stood tall and proud, casting long shadows over 2 familiar graves. There, he whispered, with them. Clementine nodded, already understanding. She pointed to the hill, then to herself. Captain Whitmore translated. She says she found their graves. She's been keeping them clean. That broke something in Amos, not in sorrow, but in peace. This child, who had lost everything, had given back to him something no one else had ever dared offer: compassion. And now, as the wind moved softly through the open barn doors, Amos closed his eyes. He didn't feel the pain anymore, didn't feel the fear, just a deep, endless quiet rising through his chest like a tide, warm and gentle. He imagined himself walking through the tall grass, up that hill, the sun at his back, and there, beneath the oak tree, waiting with smiles that never faded, stood Sarah and Emma. "Took you long enough," Sarah said, her hand outstretched, and Amos smiled. The sky was still streaked with the soft colors of dawn when Clementine stood at the edge of the porch, Amos's old blanket wrapped tightly around her shoulders. The air smelled like cedar and dust, and the earth was still damp from the morning dew. She looked out over the land, his land, now silent, now still, and felt the gentle pull of something she hadn't felt in so long she'd almost forgotten the word for it: hope. It wasn't loud. It didn't come with trumpets or bright lights. It was quiet, like the whisper of wind through the tall grass, like the warmth of a hand in yours when you're not sure if you're still allowed to trust. But it was real, and it was growing. Clementine clutched the folded note in her pocket, her note this time, the one she had written the night before, after everything was over. The barn was safe. The men who had burned her family's home were gone. Amos was gone too. But he had gone differently. He hadn't disappeared like the rest. He had fought. He had chosen her over silence. And in doing so, he had planted something in her heart that no fire could destroy. She looked toward the hill behind the house. 3 graves now rested beneath the oak tree, the wind rustling the grass gently around them. Amos was there, beside his wife and daughter, exactly where he'd said he wanted to be. And though her chest ached, Clementine didn't cry this time. She had cried enough. Now she was ready to walk forward. Captain Whitmore approached from the side of the porch, his footsteps slow, respectful. He didn't speak right away, just stood beside her, watching the sunrise. Then, after a long moment, he said gently, "The Parkers are waiting. They've got a home just outside Silver Creek, a daughter your age, big garden. They're good people." Clementine nodded. She didn't know the Parkers. She didn't know if she'd like the town, or if the other children would understand her, but she knew that Amos had trusted Whitmore, and that was enough. She pointed to the barn, then to her heart. Whitmore smiled, understanding her unspoken message. "Yes," he said quietly, "you'll always carry this place with you." He helped her onto the horse, securing the small bundle of belongings she carried. Amos's note, the signal mirror, a locket that had once belonged to her mother, and the second note, the one she had written the night before. "My name is Clementine. I cannot hear your words, but I can see your kindness. An angel once taught me that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is trust a stranger." She had folded it carefully, tucked it into her coat, a letter to her future. As they began riding down the dirt path that led away from the ranch, Clementine turned back one last time. The house stood quiet, the barn too, but neither looked abandoned. They looked at peace, like the soul of the place had been set free, just as she had. The road ahead was long. There would be challenges, learning to communicate with new people, to sleep without fear, to believe in safety again. But she was no longer the girl who had hidden in the hay, trembling in silence. She had survived the fire. She had run through the night. And in the end, she had brought justice to the men who thought she was powerless. She wasn't powerless. She never had been. And now, riding into a future that was uncertain but hers to shape, Clementine felt something begin to bloom inside her, like spring breaking through a long, frozen winter. She reached into her coat, held the letter to her chest, and whispered silently into the wind, "I'm ready." In a world that often feels cold and unforgiving, the story of Amos Thatcher and Clementine reminds us of one timeless truth. No matter how broken you feel, you still have the power to protect, to love, and to matter. Amos spent decades in silence, convinced that his life no longer had meaning. But when a frightened, voiceless child showed up at his door, everything changed. In choosing to stand up, despite the pain, despite the fear, he discovered that the smallest act of courage can echo louder than a lifetime of regret. This story teaches us that redemption doesn't come from erasing the past. It comes from acting with purpose in the present. That hope often arrives disguised as responsibility, and that the deepest healing happens not when we're saved, but when we choose to save someone else. Clementine may have been the one who needed protection, but in trusting Amos, she gave him something priceless, a reason to live one more day with meaning. And maybe that's the lesson for all of us. It's never too late to matter to someone. If you believe in the power of courage, redemption, and human connection, then subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories from the Wild West. True tales of grit, sacrifice, and the quiet heroes history almost forgot. These are more than just westerns. They're stories of the human spirit. Don't miss what comes next. Hit that subscribe button and ride with us into the heart of the frontier, where justice is earned, not given.